Hello, Edward Lambert, Effective Demand Research. This is going to be a follow-up video on the model for the Fisher effect with system dynamics. And in this video I simply want to compare two variables. I want to compare the long-run Fisher effect natural inflation level to the inflation target set by the Federal Reserve. Now these aren't always the same, and when they are different, that creates distortions in monetary policy. So we're all familiar with the inflation target set by the Fed. The Fed uses monetary policy, changing the Fed rate to try and manipulate inflation to its target, and it can do that. Now, the long-run Fisher effect natural inflation level is different. The long-run Fisher effect natural inflation level is determined by the projected Fed rate. So when you look into the future and the Fed says, okay, we're going to project, say, maybe a 2% Fed rate when we reach full employment. Okay, that's what people are figuring that's going to be the projected long-run Fed rate. And then they look at the natural real rate. And the natural real rate, maybe that's negative according to Larry Summers, or maybe it's 1% or 2%, depending on how fast the economy is growing. But there are different ways to assess what the natural rate, the natural real rate will be at full employment. So when you take this projected Fed rate minus the natural real rate, you'll get this inflation level, this natural inflation level, which people figure, well, that will be the natural inflation level when we reach full employment. And this isn't always the same as the Fed inflation target. So let's go ahead and start a simulation here. And I'm going to show you first, there's two lines that I'm going to be comparing here. First, I'm going to be comparing this blue line with the red line. The blue line is the Fed's inflation target, and the red line is this natural inflation level of the long-run Fisher effect. So in essence, when the Fisher effect has power, the economy, the inflation rate wants to move to that red line. But the Fed can keep the inflation rate at this blue line through monetary policy, through changing the Fed rate. But if the Fed was to just stop moving the Fed rate, the economy over time would try to find a way to get inflation to that red line. Okay, so these are the two lines I'm going to be comparing. Now, we start out in this situation where the long-run inflation level is above where the Fed is targeting. If the Fisher effect has an influence over the inflation rate, you'll want to see inflation trying to move upwards towards that red line. But the Fed can use monetary policy to keep it down there. I'm now going to increase this Fisher attraction. Now this is a variable that determines the power that the Fisher effect has to try and move inflation from that blue line to the red line. So as I increase this, there's a power to try and move that inflation upwards towards the red line. Now what would you think would happen if the Fisher effect is in place? What would happen is that inflation, there's this built-up, pent-up energy from the Fisher attraction trying to move inflation upwards. So what do you see happen? You'll see that the Fed rate over here to the right, the Fed rate will stabilize in on a 2%, but then at some point the Fed rate will have to keep rising in that stable, steady state. Will have to keep rising in order to fight the Fisher effect that's trying to push inflation up. So the Fed rate will have to continually rise and rise and rise to keep inflation at the 2% target, instead of rising upwards to this higher long-run natural level. And we can imagine that this is what happened in the 1970s, where inflation was rising and the Fed was trying to maintain a lower target, but people were expecting that inflation was going to be higher. And so the Fed rate should have just been increasing and increasing the Fed rate, but it would have been increasing it forever and ever. So the Fed did not catch on to this, and they kept the Fed rate low, and by keeping the Fed rate low, that allowed inflation to start rising to get out of control. So now you have this other situation where I'm going to now move that red line. I'm now going to move that red line right here. The red line is now below the blue line. So what do you think would happen in a situation like this? Well, what would happen in a situation like this is that inflation wants to drop to this lower level where people are expecting a lower inflation rate. And so the Fed rate wants to drop, but the Fed will maintain Fed policy to stabilize the inflation rate at this level up here. But then at a certain time, you'll see that the Fed rate has to continually go lower and lower and lower to keep fighting against this Fisher effect that wants to drive the inflation rate lower. And eventually, the Fed rate hits the zero lower bound. This has happened in Europe, United States, Japan, and it may eventually happen in China. We'll see. But as long as inflation expectations are below the Fed target, over time, that will drive the Fed rate down towards the zero lower bound. And if I increase the Fisher attraction here, you'll see something interesting, is that inflation will not drive down below zero, meaning deflation. Inflation simply wants to drop down to this long-run Fisher effect natural inflation level. Once the Fed rate hits the zero lower bound, inflation simply wants to drop down to its natural level. That's all it wants to do. It doesn't want to keep going down to deflation. So when you hear people talking about all these deflation worries, no, the worry is not deflation. This is just a natural process where the Fed rate over time has reached its zero lower bound. It cannot fight the Fisher effect any longer. And what will inflation do? It won't. The bottom won't drop out. The inflation will simply relax down to its natural level. And that's what we're seeing right now. Now, this natural level could be negative if you push this projected Fed rate very low, and you're still seeing a positive natural real rate, which means this could be Japan, where they had deflation, a stable inflation for a long time. They simply created a position where this long-run Fisher effect projected Fed rate was lower than the natural real rate. And that drove the red line down here below zero, below 0%. So over time, once their call rate, that's what you call it in Japan, once their call rate went down to zero, that lost traction. And then, lo and behold, inflation simply relaxed down with the Fisher effect to its natural level, which was below zero. So there's no fear. I don't see any fear of deflation going on, because this is what I'm seeing, that people are projecting more or less a long-run projected Fed rate of, say, 2.5%, 2 to 3%. The Fed says 2%, maybe some people say 3%, but the Fed says 2%. At full employment, they're going to try and keep the Fed rate lower than the normal 4%. They're going to try and keep it around 2%. Maybe some people are thinking, well, the economy is growing fast, it's going to be around 3%. Okay, let's say 2.4% right here. And the natural real rate, let's put it at 1%. People don't know whether it's going to be negative, according to Larry Summers, or it's going to be around 2% or 1%. Let's just say 1%. And so you have the Fed target here at 2%, but then you have this natural inflation level where people are trying to figure out what's inflation really going to be at, taking into consideration where the Fed rate is going and where this natural real rate is going. You have the situation where this long-run inflation level, natural inflation level, is below the Fed target. The Fed rate policy eventually hit zero lower bound right here. And that's where it's staying. And now we're just seeing inflation drop down to its natural level. So what does this mean? Does this mean inflation is going to be perking back up to the 2% level? No. Not unless some of these other variables start changing. For example, not unless people start expecting the Fed to really do maybe a 3% long-run project. The Fed is right now projecting 2%. But if they said, okay, we're going to let the Fed rate go up to 3 or 4%, if they said 4%, well, that would now put this long-run natural inflation level above their inflation target. And that would allow the Fed rate to go up above, because there's this natural tendency for inflation to start rising at that point. But then if you say, okay, maybe the economy can grow a little faster, take it up to 2% here, then you have your stabilization point. You have the projected Fed rate at 4%. You have a 2% natural real rate of growth in the economy, population, productivity, and all that, which is now going to equal the inflation target of 2%. And you're going to have your stability. But the Fed is not projecting a 4% right now. The Fed is projecting much lower, say around a 2.4%. And people are expecting lower growth around in there. So that's why we're seeing inflation dropping down, maybe somewhere right in here. We're seeing inflation dropping down to 1.7, 1.6, maybe we'll see 1.5, maybe we'll see 1.4, somewhere in this area. And it's going to stay there. Inflation's simply going to stay at this level if these other variables don't change, if the Fed does not change its forward guidance. If the Fed starts saying, whoa, the economy is really having a tough time here, the Fed may say, okay, we're going to keep the Fed rate even lower, maybe even 1%. And if they go too low, they run the risk of driving this long-run natural inflation level down to 0%. And that will create the inflation to be even lower. So there's a lot going on here, and I suppose I could talk more about this, but I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to call this done.